Okay. So now I'll share my screen. And here we are. All right, everybody. Well, thank you once again so much for inviting me to share a little bit, just some real, I want to emphasize that these are just some real top lines. We will be providing a written report that will kind of dig into further iterations of, an analysis in terms of the turnout data. So these are just highlights to kind of share, from the work that folks did last year. The other big caveat I want to, before digging into this report, is what we're primarily, this report is a reflection of, is work that was conducted using VAN, or like the voter activation network. So like some of the activities that Laura alluded to around tabling, or, at events, and, the hundreds of events that folks attended, and some of the kind of on the street activity is not necessarily fully captured in this database. So this is really more so the an analysis of the targeted voter outreach that was done using things like door knocking, or phone banking, or texting, or sending out mail, those kinds of activities. So I just kind of wanted to just offer that framework before digging in. Yeah. And the first thing, the next thing I wanted to just do is kind of a little primer, just to make sure we all they're using the same language here, because I'm going to kind of use some terms and want to make sure that before I dig into the results, that we all know what those terms are. As I just mentioned, VAN, which is also called sort of a short acronym for the Voter Activation Network. It's essentially just a computer program that is used by both nonpartisan and partisan entities to contact voters and record progress. And the data that lives in there is from the voter file. Different vendors offer it, but essentially it is a data set that is uploaded into that platform that has all kinds of information, including their vote history, demographic characteristics, census data, that's enhanced. And so one of the things that we supported the cohort organizations in doing was defining their target universe for their targeted outreach. And what simply that means is just the list of people that they wanted to talk to. And so they just, each organization, based on their communities and the constituencies that they work with, including the folks who partnered with NYIC and Minqua, and also had their own individual universes dependent on the communities that they work with, had certain desires around what kind of characteristics, for example, APA Voice desire to do in-language outreach with different Asian American communities. So we supported developing targeted outreach lists that focus on folks in those communities, for example. And then another term is vote propensity, which is a model that is essentially estimates the likelihood of someone in a given election year to vote in that particular, and usually actually the metric is around the general election, but we use it as kind of a baseline to work from around how likely someone is to vote in any given election within that year. And so the scores range from 0 to 100. So the closer an individual is to 100, the more likely they are to be someone who's a regular voter. And the closer someone is to 0, the less likely they may be a new voter, or someone who is never, doesn't vote very frequently. And then the last is attempts, which is just simply the number of times somebody tried to talk to someone on the list using any of the tactics that I mentioned, whether it's phone banking or calling or texting. So I just wanted to just offer that kind of before digging into some of the other pieces, just to make sure we're, so things are hopefully clear. And just a quick reminder of who the groups were, who participated last year. It's a really, I think, an amazing, diverse set of organizations. I will say, just from the perspective of the New York Civic Engagement Table, most of them were already table partners, folks that we had a long-term relationship with. For us, was this opportunity through GoVote, was an opportunity to be introduced to the Center for Independence of the Disabled in New York, Center for Law and Social Justice, El Puente, and College and Community Fellowship were sort of the folks that were introduced to the table through this grant, which was a really wonderful opportunity. And one thing I will add is, for 3 of those 4 organizations that were newer to us in terms of our relationship, that got introduced through GoVote, after the sort of first phase, this 2022 program concluded, they decided that they wanted to continue working with us long-term in building out their civic engagement programming, outside of the confines of this particular grant, which is something we're really excited about. And we're really thrilled that was an opportunity that was afforded by this program. And then just some top line highlights. I know Laura mentioned 2 million. I think that's a reflection of that this is just the data in van. So what we have in terms of the targeted voter outreach is a universe of 1.3 million voters that were reached out using these tactics, and about 1.5 million attempts. So that's a reflection, like I said, of those phone calls, those door knocks, and also there's a couple of other ones. I think phones and text and walking are pretty self-explanatory, but a few other ones that are not so obvious. One is community canvas, which actually is just a metric that was utilized by one organization, United Neighborhood Houses. They had a really interesting program where they was very site-based with their kind of network of the network of organizations that they work with, getting pledges to vote from folks who came in on site at certain particular locations. So I see a question. So the terms of is this in reference to the universe of voters? This is unduplicated. And so then in terms of 2 million
separate individuals.
Oh, yeah. So I think I think that the sort of distinction I wanted to make was folks may have other internal, like, for example, if they have other ways of like through a Google Sheet or like a form or other ways of tracking folks, especially at in-person events, because that's one of the limits. I will get to one strategy that we are kind of working on to deploy around having a better way to capture all of those things in one place. But some of the stuff that's not in here is really more a reflection of the work that was done kind of besides like actual address by address door knocking, which was relatively small scale. But the bigger scale kind of just like in-person events and tabling where you kind of capture lots of different people, that did not end up in this database. I hope that clarifies. If not, I can come back to it. Because actually the other one I wanted to clarify too is just relational. We call it relational, which is this other tactic, which is one of the ways we're trying to creatively think through how to capture some of that data around those in-person events where tabling or street canvassing or those kinds of opportunities that was very much a big part of a lot of the work that folks did. And so Reach is one tool that we're using, and that is one of the uses is a way to capture that people's information and be able to then match it back to this central database that's already capturing all of this targeted voter outreach and match them back to that voter file, so we can identify, oh, this person was contacted at this street festival, and now we found them on the voter file here. We can match it and be able to track whether they in fact turned out to vote. So that's sort of the next phase. We did some piloting, which I'll get into of it for the general election. But the next phase, I think, especially as we're thinking through like planning and building out further capacity, is really thinking about how to increase the use of that tool so we can capture some of that stuff, so we can really see the folks that are contacted via those in-person crowdsourced methods, how they turn out, because that's kind of harder to measure if they're not in van. I'm going to pause here and see if there's any other clarifying questions on anything I just went over before continuing.
Melody,
yeah.
Just the 1.3 million that's the unduplicated number, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. It's not. There's no duplication in that number at all.
Those are individuals.
Those are individual voters.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. Any other clarifying questions? Okay. Cool. Oops, sorry. There we go. And just highlight kind of what the program looked like in terms of the role that we played in working with folks on the ground. We held 4 cohort-wide convenings over the course of the last year. And in addition to that, in between all of those kind of cohort-wide meetings where we had kind of collective discussion, peer learning, we held 49 one-on-one meetings with organizations. So that's where we really got into digging in deeper into individual programs. And additionally, we hosted kind of coordinated cohort phone banks. They were remote, and it was just an opportunity to kind of build some enthusiasm, and it was volunteer. So like if organizations were like, oh, we're doing our own phone banks, we don't need that, but it was an opportunity to just provide some space and support for folks who were doing virtual phone banks and wanted to come in together and send their volunteers into one place and kind of build a little more energy and excitement around phone banking. And then Laura already mentioned that soon, hopefully imminently, we'll be seeing some results from experiments that were conducted in partnership with Don Green at Columbia University. So we supported 5 of the organizations and setting up experiments since we help hold the data. We help them with the target, developing their target universe and kind of working with Don and his team and the organization to make sure that everything was set up in a way to ensure the integrity of the experiments that were conducted. And then just as already stated, we've conducted a lot of trainings. It's just kind of an example of, sampling of some of the trainings that we conducted. One of the challenges that came up really often with folks as we moved on and kind of, Laura alluded to like voter fatigue, but there was also some volunteer fatigue. And so a lot of folks had, challenges around like getting enough folks to come to those phone banks or, come out and volunteer to do activities. So that was something that we provided some additional support around because it was elevated as an area of need amongst the cohort organizations. And then now getting into kind of a little more of a breakdown into that number of that big aggregate number. Here's a breakdown of, based on race and age of the folks. So the majority of the folks in that universe were BIPOC. So I would say it's like over 60%, 60 something percent of them, as you'll see here, 37% is Latino and 26% Black and 18% Asian. And there is one section I just want to acknowledge that says, I'm sorry, yes, that's right, is that 5% that's unknown. That's just really a limitation of the sort of data set of the voter file, that there are some folks that just haven't been, frankly, like categorized via likely ethnicity or race. And so that's just what that accounts for. And as you'll see by age, the breakdown is actually, the distribution is fairly even, except for like the youngest end of the spectrum. And also for us in the way that we approach how people, how organizations determine how they want to, the parameters for building out their list is really dependent and driven by the organization and their goals and what they're prioritizing in terms of being able to reach out to particular constituencies. So we support them and help them kind of navigate the data, but really the sort of strategic decision making around like who exactly they want to talk to is really driven by each of the partner organizations. And then back to that question of vote propensity, because I know this is one of the key goals of this collaboration is to really move the needle with folks who are not as engaged in the process. So you'll see here the there's a huge kind of chunk of folks at the very lowest end of that 0 to 9.99% category of, on the score. 35% of them are in that bucket, and then that's the largest portion of the universe. And then overall, I think for most practitioners in this space, like anyone who's under 50% or even 60% is considered to be quite challenging to turn out. Like folks who are running like more partisan or persuasion campaigns don't even talk to any of the people that are below that score. They're really focused on the folks who frankly who are 90 and above, and maybe if they have more resources, they'll spend some time talking to the people who are like, between 80 and 90, and then like everyone else really gets very limited to zero engagement from kind of the large, sort of more partisan oriented entities that may be doing outreach in communities. Any questions about anything before I start getting into the turnout for each election? Okay, cool. So on to turnout results. So I'm just going to go by each primary, each election. And then we can do a couple of just like highlights at the end here. But so for June, just a note on the work, because I kind of show the aggregate, but this is just a bit of a sense of like what the work looked like for each election. So 8 of the 11 cohort members were active, and that's really a reflection of some of those newer groups who had never done civic engagement work before. It took them a little more time to ramp up to be kind of operational. So I just wanted to just acknowledge that. And so we had over 500,000 attempts, which is what I said, like just any one of those ways that folks have tried to contact a targeted voter, and then over 7,000 conversations. And so what that means is like conversations or contacts is kind of used a little interchangeably. We're going to use the word conversations for this presentation today. And that's just simply like they actually got a hold of somebody responded, whether it was positive or not is, but it's just like there was an actual back and forth conversation between the individual and the person of the voter who was reached out to. And so here is just some top lines here. So the sort of reported turnout for June was approximately 12%. And you'll see in the first bar graph on your left, the overall turnout of this is just of our universe. So it's that universe of 1.3 million people encompassing everybody across all vote propensities, et cetera. That's just the baseline turnout that we have, which is a little slightly lower than, which makes sense because there's an overrepresentation of lower propensity voters probably in our universe versus the general public. And then you'll see the folks who were canvassed, who were people that in fact responded and through any one of these methods that I mentioned. They turned out a little bit higher, and actually in fact higher than the overall general public's turnout in the June primary. And then you'll see on the right, BIPOC turnout, so that's a combination of all voters of color, similarly had a larger bump in turnout for the folks who are actually had a conversation with one of the GoVote cohort organizations. Any questions about this?
Yes, Melody, did you do this analysis for your other members of the table already? And, you know, in the past, in 2021, you did an analysis comparing GoVoteNYC grantees partners to your broader table membership, and actually had found that the GoVote groups had generated or contributed to or saw higher turnout than the other members of the table. So I'm just wondering how members of the table compare to these, you know, very lackluster numbers.
Well, I will say, I want to maybe I should have also caveated. I mean, I think this is Laura said it, but I want to just emphasize, this was a really challenging electoral environment. I want to say yes, these numbers, but the reality is the overall turnout was 12%. So for folks that had a conversation with somebody, for it to be meaningfully, and also the other thing I want to also emphasize is that these are aggregate numbers. So it's even harder to show any impact when, I think when we see Don Green's experiments, those you can have, or, we can kind of dig into that, but I just wanted to offer a little more of a glass half full framework. But I think, we haven't done that yet, but we will offer that in our final written analysis, which will be much more in depth than the kind of highlights I'm offering today. But we haven't done that cut of the analysis yet, but making a note to make sure it's included.
Thank you.
But yes,
I had a quick question about language, because I was a little bit surprised to hear that there were only 11 languages being used by the grantees to do the engagement, just due to New York City, right? And even some of those grantees listed, I know that they have 30 languages within their membership, etc. I don't know if you have you probably don't have the answer to this right now, but if there's any consideration or an analysis of non-official languages, so how many of these organizations are reaching minority languages, right? Non-New York City translated, to seem like that extra step of where folks might not have any information about these elections at all, versus someone like me who's Spanish speaking, that the city would provide, here's an election coming up, or any of those 10 languages.
Yeah, no, that's a really great, it's interesting because I think for the groups themselves, it's ensuring that they have the capacity to create the materials, to translate the scripts, to be able to have that, the resources to include other additional languages, and then folks on their, whether it's volunteers or on their team who can then communicate, meaningfully in those languages. I think those are real challenges in terms of expanding the number of languages that are being folks are communicating in. So I think, I know that's not exactly an answer, but I think it's something that I think is there is a appetite for having that conversation amongst the cohort organizations around how can we further expand our language capacity, and to be able to reach to exactly what your point that you're making, Sabrina, around we need to be able to ensure that folks that there isn't already pre-existing materials have a way that they're being communicated with about elections. So I think it's that's really an area I would identify as an opportunity for growth.
And just last question, and Seema knows I like geek out on data, so I will ask one more question and that's it. But is there any indication on Van whether or not that these voters are like American-born citizens or whether they were naturalized? And the reason I just want to ask that is like the thought of, I don't know the terminology, but like a proxy voter, like, you know, maybe if you have a certain person it's thinking about like they're voting for a family potentially, you know, just interesting to think about the impact on perhaps naturalized citizens in some of this outreach to immigrant communities versus American born would be like a super interesting distinction.
Yeah, I agree. That's, you know, it's interesting. That's one I'll have to circle back with my team on, because there might be a way to do that, but it might not be kind of already kind of off the shelf in Van, as it, like in terms of like what the enhanced, you know, voter file data offers. So I think that would be the one thing. I think it's a really interesting question, especially given the sort of the communities that many of the groups are reaching out to. That would be a really interesting thing to explore. So, okay.
So Melody, I had a question.
Yeah.
Do you have the capacity, or does Van have the capacity to do, you know, like a geographic breakdown, either by borough or by neighborhood? Since we know that some of the races were, you know, competitive, there may be a new candidate, brand new candidate, that kind of thing, but some of them were fairly not exciting. So I just wondered if there's any way to break this out into geographic divisions.
Yes. Yeah, we can definitely. We did look at borough, and I just, for the sake of I'm making a cut somewhere, I didn't include it here, but we did look at borough. And I will say, I was going to try to find it up, but I'll just say offhand that by far the majority of, which is not surprising given the sort of breakdown of the groups, the majority of the voters reached out to were in Queens and Brooklyn, I believe, if my memory is serving me correctly. Like it's like Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Staten Island, I think was like kind of the order, but Queens and Brooklyn were pretty similar. But I think the sort of part two of what you're asking, I think would require, and the answer is yes, we can do that. I think what we could do is look at because we can also look at it by beyond borough, we can also look at it by political district. So like it can be by, you know, especially for June, for example, if there were any salient assembly campaigns happening that might have had, you know, that might look a little different than other places. And maybe even the turnout citywide was 12%, the turnout maybe in those places might have been a little higher, even across the general population. And then to compare how folks that were reached out through the GoVote program would compare to that, I think is something we can definitely do. So I'm just making sure to make a note of that. So yeah, really good ideas, because there's so many different ways there's a lot of different ways you could look at this information. So I really appreciate the ideas around like ensuring that we are inclusive of these other frameworks. So I'm going to take us to, because I will right now I just have this on June, but we will add what you just requested and a few other pieces when we have our full report. But I'm going to take us now to August, which I'm going to just really want to caveat that August is, I consider it from a data perspective and like a political, like organizing perspective, a real anomaly, right? Like, I don't know if I hope we don't find ourselves in this situation again, where we have finding out in the spring that there's going to be a primary a few months later. But despite that, folks still managed to make some work happen, even though it was unanticipated. Folks did not have, necessarily additional resources beyond what they had already planned to expend in June and in November. So that's reflected in the total number of attempts. You'll see it like in June, it was more than 500,000 attempts. And now in August, it was far fewer, but that was also, two reasons, I think. One is just like the reality of having to scramble to put together something and really, really quickly. And two, not every single place had an actual election. Not everybody was eligible to vote because it was, well, we didn't have, like we did in June, a statewide primary. So like in June, there was a statewide primary for governor, so that everybody was eligible to vote. Whereas in August, not everybody's eligible to vote because there wasn't a statewide election. And so it was dependent on whether your district had a primary that you happen to reside in, which also is challenging and confusing to voters, and, you know, also a real organizational challenge for folks. So, you know, even though, so you'll see the turnout was even lower, which is to be expected in an August primary. You know, it was just across the board, incredibly low turnout. And especially for the folks that we're talking to, who are primarily, you know, mid to low propensity voters, it's incredibly, you know, it's just, it was like, that's why I'm like, this is an anomaly. I don't feel like we'll be in this situation again, assuming, you know, crazy things happen in New York, but it's going to be difficult to find anything comparable to the situation we were in August of last year. However, despite that, I will say, you know, even though the turnout overall was incredibly low end, we still were able to measure a slight bump amongst the folks that were, you know, contacted by GoVote organizations. So, you know, I hesitate to extrapolate or draw a ton of conclusions based on this, just because of just how unusual the situation was. But, you know, just, yeah, any questions about August? Okay, I'll move us along. But just so you know, folks still did a ton of work despite the challenges, and it was just a really challenging environment to conduct voter education work. So I'll take us to November, which I have a few other additional kind of cuts of information, like turnout by tactic and stuff. So there'll be a few more pieces. But and of course, in November, all 11 cohort members ran a program in November. So this was the kind of largest scale moment last year in terms of across all 3 elections. So you'll see that reflected. There was more than almost 200,000 more attempts in November versus June. And that's reflected in more conversations. And this is also the election where we introduced that kind of relational program using this app Reach, but where that just happens to be the app we're using. It doesn't have to be that app, but that's the one that we have access to. And so this is where we piloted it, was for the November general election. And I believe one of the experiments that we'll be hearing from Don Green and his team about will be an experiment using that tactic. So we're looking forward to that. So you'll see here, turnout was 36% overall citywide, which is still not amazing for a general election. And it was, as was kind of widely reported, lower than it was in the last gubernatorial electoral year, which was 2018. So, but still, despite that. And so the thing that's interesting, the thing I will point out that you'll see that's kind of is a bit different of a pattern. We saw kind of actually across both primaries that overall are folks who were actually communicated with by GoVote cohort organizations. They surpassed, even though the turnout was still low, they surpassed the overall turnout in the entire city. And we see here they're kind of not quite surpassing it, but I think the thing that's really important, that's very different about a general election environment versus a primary election environment, is that generally there is more happening, even though there's a lot of criticism around how effectively communities were being reached out to. Still, given all of that, there's still a lot more news coverage, just earned media, a lot more just, even though maybe folks, we can have a different conversation around how timely or effective the partisan efforts were from the partisan side, but still there was more happening in November. There typically tends to be, at least historically. And I think that's still, even with the kind of how things happened last year, still true. So it's much harder to show to surpass kind of the overall turnout in a general election environment. However, I think there's still something really interesting here where you see, our overall universe on the left-hand side turned out 10 points lower than the city. So one of the things that I think was really cool, and I think a great observation, is that the GoVote organizations were able to, what I would say, close the gap, right, between the voter turnout amongst the general voting age population, registered voters across the city, and folks, because as we saw in the beginning of this presentation, the majority of these folks in this universe are much lower propensity and much less likely to vote. So I would frame this as more like these folks, like the work that our partners were able to do really helped close the gap between, we weren't able to surpass, but that's a really tall order and really more something that you can see in a primary environment because the turnout is even lower. But still really impressive work on the part of the organizations to close that gap amongst folks who tend to be mid to low propensity voters, which is the majority of that universe. So I just kind of wanted to offer that framing in terms of like looking at these observations of the data. Any questions about this before I think the next slide is around turnout by tactic.
Melody, is it possible to know for the New York City turnout of 36%, the spread of propensity scores among the 36%? So you know what I mean? Like we're all the 36% of New Yorkers who turned out, or not all, but like was a vast majority of them above, you know, a score of 90. Does CFB or BOE issue that information?
Well, they don't, but we have that data because we have the whole data set of who turned out, including, you know, everybody. So we can look at, and so we can compare it to the vote propensity model that we have. So yes, we can do that and look at what that total turnout looked like. And I think this doesn't quite answer your question, but this is something I thought would be also, it's kind of tangentially related to your question, Martha, because this is more about the folks that we did talk to. But I think your point around like who were the folks who overall, I think we can even see a greater difference. But so yes, we can follow up with the vote propensity breakdown of the 36%, the total turnout, and then also. So the answer is yes. And I'd also like to share this because this kind of gets to this vote propensity question as well, or kind of another piece of it. So of the folks, as you saw earlier, like a huge chunk of the people in the universe are under score under 50% on the vote propensity model. And so while I will say, even though while overall, this is lower, much lower than but that's to be expected, right? We know that these are folks that are the hardest to turn out. You know, they require the most engagement, the most interaction, most relationship building. So it's to be expected that it would be lower than the overall voting population. But I still think the fact that there was any needle movement amongst this, you know, side of the kind of voter contact universe, I think is really remarkable. Because it's incredibly difficult to show this especially in like a just aggregate, like here's the full number. So I think that's just something we wanted to share. So yeah, to have even like in this kind of aggregate context of 5-point differential between folks who were contacted and folks who weren't, I think is a really quite remarkable, given the, you know, how difficult it is to move folks who are on this end of on the spectrum of vote propensity. But any questions about this? Okay, great. So the next one, this one is turnout by tactic. I will say, so there's a couple of things I want to point out here. The texting, I have to just address the texting column because we were very surprised. Our team was very surprised to see this. This is very unusual. I think for folks that, you know, if this is not something like we've been like living and breathing in this data and like doing very large scale text programs across the city, across the state. And this has not been the trend that we've been observing writ large. So we're going to do some additional layers of digging to kind of see who those people are, because that's a little unusual to see, because typically texting performs much less well than things like walking or even phone. So it's a little bit unusual, but I think it's worth looking at because one of the things I did want to point out as well on the other end of this graph and just to clarify, like attempted means that folks were reached out to, there may or may not have been a conversation. Canvas means that there was in fact a conversation. And so on the right-hand side, you'll see that that's like an incredibly remarkable, I mean, I will, you know, caveat that because it was a pilot, it wasn't a huge scale in terms of the work that folks did around the relational stuff, but I want to just reiterate kind of what that looked like or kind of dig into it a little bit more. So I sort of mentioned it was an opportunity for folks to capture some of the data that doesn't really get captured in, when there's those more kind of other things that show up in other places and doesn't get captured in this database where we can actually compare it to turnout. So there's two main use cases. One is the example that we were talking about before around like tabling events, kind of the crowd canvassing scenario where you're out and about and having a conversation, and you get somebody, you have your script and your question around like, hey, are you planning to vote? And you then can capture that using an app that then can be able to match that back to the voter base, to the voter file in Van. And then the other use case, which is kind of more like encouraging volunteers, members, organizers to contact their own networks. This is like another sort of way to use it. And I will have to give a shout out to College and Community Fellowship, who were like amazing. We're like, okay, who wants to try out this tool? We really want to try it because we've heard there's a lot of potential, and we did a small, like our organization as background, we did a small pilot a number of years ago, and it didn't take off with our partners. We were like, wait a minute, there's a real opportunity here. So they were, we're like, there was a few groups that were like, we want to try it. So El Puente tried it, College and Community Fellowship, and then one other organization that was suddenly escaping my memory. But I have to really shout out those folks, because they're, I know they have this fellowship program, and their fellows really took it on, and they were like, yes, we're going to use this to contact our, folks in our, in our address book and our phones, and like, just, have that conversation. Because the thing that's really been borne out, and this is something that I'm sure that Professor Green can dig into more, there's been a ton of body of research that's shown that, people who, if your cousin or friend or neighbor is telling you, that someone you actually know, that, hey, this is a really important election, I really want to encourage you to show up and vote, that's going to have a much greater impact than folks who maybe, are from a trusted organization, but just having that additional layer of a personal relationship has a huge impact. So even though it was a small, relatively small scale pilot, we still see a remarkable bump in the folks who voted versus not, who were contacted via that method. So that's why I just wanted to kind of make a little pit stop on that one, and kind of zoom in on that a little bit more. Any questions about this in general, about what you see in terms of turnout by tactic?
I can see the 43% relational attempted, but I can't see the blue. If there's a relation, but it could just be because I'm not. Maybe I can reorganize my Zoom, your faces. Oh wait, can I move it? Oh, I see it. 42. Okay. Sorry.
It's all good.
Now
I was like, oh, it's not working. It looks fine on the screen. Okay.
No,
cool.
sorry. I had to move the faces down. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any questions?
Melody, where would social media fall in all of these tactics?
Yeah, I mean, I think for, in terms of we don't have a really, one thing that we have that the one thing that we can do in Van offhand that I can think of really is designed to track contacting folks through ads, which I know is not, which is valid way to do things. And we didn't have any groups this cycle anyway that did that. And I will say that there is it is very trackable. It's just would not be in using Van. Like there are other tools that you can use to sort of see, like we have a consultant on our team who works with us on our communication strategy, and he's like, there is different, so it wouldn't be using this particular database, but it is trackable. I don't know that there was anyone that had like a intentional, I'm sure obviously people communicated through their lists and stuff, but I don't know that anyone had like a targeted social media. I know there was some discussion about it, but I don't think any of the cohort, at least qualitatively, maybe if Laura has anybody in the reports who mentioned something, but I don't think so. It didn't end up being, I think that's something as we look towards like this sort of planning space, I think that's definitely something on kind of the list of potential tactics to revisit, and kind of exploring how that can be incorporated in a more intentional way. Any other questions?
I'm not surprised that there's obviously a big gap between the number of attempted and the number of actual conversations or canvassed, but do you see any trends there? I mean, is that overall kind of what you would expect, and anything in terms of differences between the elections and how, in terms of how those numbers stacked up?
You know, I think overall, you know, there's so many, I think, you know, this sort of points to the challenge of kind of looking at this observational data at this aggregate kind of level, which is why I'm really excited about those experiments. I'm like, this is my data nerd coming out. But I think, you know, I think it's something that we will, as we kind of do the next kind of phase of this analysis and do our final report, is dig in a little bit more and parse out, because I think that's one of the things we started to do a little bit, but we have to do that for all three elections, is look at like, who were the people, like where did they land on this vote propensity model, who did respond to a given form of outreach, and what did that look like? And I think one of the things we're starting to observe, there are some subtle differences, but I don't know that we're at a place where we can make a conclusion necessarily yet, if that makes sense. Cool. So, oops, I'm just going to take us to just tying, you know, highlights. So as was mentioned earlier, 68%, actually, I was like over 60%, I couldn't remember. 68% of the targeted voters are BIPOC, 64% of them are low propensity. And, you know, despite the overall low turnout across the elections, we can say observationally that the BIPOC voters who were successfully canvassed by GoVote groups turned out at a higher rate than most other folks in all three elections. And as I mentioned, we were successful in piloting a new tool, which was not part of our original plan, but really a response to kind of the dynamics and the needs that folks were raising as we were meeting with folks in Reach. And then, as we already discussed, the voters contacted with those relational tactics really had the highest impact in terms of actually many more of them turning out to in fact vote compared to the other forms of outreach. And yeah, and then also just the majority of the organizations, the vast majority, are continuing to work with us to continue to build out their capacity around doing this work year round. So that's actually my conclusion. I will say there's definitely some really exciting opportunities, and, you know, really looking forward to the opportunity to kind of continue digging in with folks and thinking about some of the challenges that, you know, folks encountered, really digging a little further into this data and thinking creatively around like some of the things like, yeah, how can we incorporate, like, what are some intentional ways to incorporate social media, broadening the in-language outreach, you know, thinking through how to expand the relational outreach, and just all of these different ideas that have kind of bubbled to the surface through the course of this project last year, and opportunities to really think collectively with the groups around how to build that out to be really strong going into 2025. So really looking forward to the next step, and I will stop there and see if there's any additional questions.
Anybody? Melody, thank you. That was really informative, and we appreciate all the work, and we will look forward to seeing your report. And, you know, I guess if you have questions about this piece of things, just feel free to email them to me and I can share them. Anything you might want to see in the report that comes to you later. But thanks, Melody. Appreciate that.
So much.
Thank
you.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So we're going to go into executive committee in just a minute, but before we do, I have an announcement, and then I'm going to turn it over to Martha and Pat, who have a couple of announcements for the full group. But we are planning another webinar that will happen in May, and it will be on the youth vote. So we're doing that in collaboration with Philanthropy New York I think it'll be a really good program. You'll get an invitation and details soon. So look for that. And now I'm going to turn it over to our current co-chairs, Pat Swan and Martha King. Thanks. And Melody, thank you very much.
Thanks, Melody.
Thank you, Melody.
Thank you. And I just realized I have to make you hosting and I almost
Oh, thanks. Yeah, sorry.
accidentally ended your meeting. That would have been terrible. So I will do that and then I will take off, but thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Melody. Pat, do you want to start?
So sure. There's some changes that have been happening. I think all of you, I hope that all of you got my own communication about my shifting from a full-time role